The moon should not have bled that night. It climbed the ridge like an omen, red as fresh memory, heavy as a held breath, and the snow caught its light, as if the world were being marked. The wind moved through the pines with the quiet certainty of something that had been waiting for them long before they arrived. The cave ahead looked less like shelter and more like a throat cut into the earth, a place made to keep secrets rather than protect them. Stone drank the moonlight and returned it in thin, trembling veins, like something beneath the surface was trying to wake. They approached in a silence that was not empty, but full of things left unsaid. Snow whispered under boots. Breath came in white ghosts that vanished before they could be named. Einar kept his spear angled like a question. His shoulders sat against the cold and the ache in his side. Astrid walked with a steadiness that was practiced and brittle. The linen at her throat lay pale against skin that had the river's pallor. Between them, the air held the small, dangerous geometry of two people who had learned to trust by inches. The cave smelled of peat and old smoke, of resin, and the faint metallic tang of offerings left and forgotten. Symbols were carved into the stone at the entrance. Circles and reeds, women with half faces, runes that had been smoothed by hands and time. The carvings were not merely decoration. They were a language of thresholds, a grammar for bargains. The priestesses who had once tended this place had left their marks like a chorus of warnings. The blood moon made the grooves glow faintly, as if the stone remembered the light and was answering it. Astrid's hand hovered at the edge of the carvings, fingers trembling, though she did not know why. The rune at her throat stirred under the moon's wash, a small, painful pulse that ran like a cold thread down her spine. It was not a simple ache. It was a memory that had weight. The mark tightened as if someone had pressed a thumb to the inside of her skin. She swallowed, and the sound was small in the hush. The rune answered with a flare so quick she thought it might be imagined, then settled like a bell struck and allowed to ring. Einar watched her with a look that was both protective and raw, with questions he could not yet ask. He had seen the rune answer before. Frost blooming at her fingertips, a breath that could freeze a saddle. But under the blood moon, it was different, sharper, more insistent, as if the world itself had been given permission to notice. He moved closer, not touching, but close enough that the heat of his body was a counterpoint to the cold that lived in her. The motion was small and ordinary, and it steadied them both. He tightened the red strip at her wrist, the knot a soldier's promise remade in the dark. They stepped into the cave and the air changed. The mouth swallowed the moonlight and returned only the amber of a small, stubborn fire Einar coaxed from damp wood. Flames threw their faces into a slow chiaroscuro. The moon's copper at the entrance, the hearth's orange at their feet, the aurora's green leaking through cracks like a vein. Shadows pooled and moved like living things. The carvings along the walls seemed to lean in the firelight, their grooves catching the flame and making the priestesses' faces look almost alive. Tension sat between them like a third body. Distrust had been a necessary armor in the months since the riders had come. Trust had been a dangerous luxury. Each had learned to measure the other in small gestures. The way Einar's jaw tightened when he thought of orders. The way Astrid's fingers flexed when she tried to keep the frost small. Words felt too large for the cave. Instead, they traded small morses, water warmed, bandage tightened, a hand held for a breath. Those gestures were intimate in a way that frightened them both. The carvings told a story in fragments. A woman at a river, hands cupped, a ledger balanced on a stone, reeds braided into crowns. The river bride myth lived in the grooves, patient and patient again, and the rune at Astrid's throat hummed like a bell when the moonlight touched the stone. The priestesses had been silent for a long time, but their work remained. A chorus of thresholds that had once opened to hell and closed again. The cave felt like a place that remembered vows and kept receipts. Astrid pressed her palm to the wall, feeling the cold of the stone through her glove. The rune at her throat flared in answer, a pain that was both physical and old. She had bargained with the river once and learned the ledger of the dead. Now the ledger's handwriting was in the stone, and it read her name in margins she had not yet learned to read. Shame and relief braided in her chest. Shame for what she had taken. Relief that the cave might hold what the world would not. Einar's eyes searched her face, as if trying to read the runes there. He wanted to ask the question that had been growing, like a splinter under his skin. What had she given? And what had she taken? But the cave's hush made his questions small. He settled instead for a practical tether. He fed the fire, he wrapped the bandage tighter, he kept his shoulder between her and the mouth of the cave. His presence was a promise that felt both fragile and absolute. Something moved deeper in the dark, not a footstep, but a shift of air, a settling of stone. The carvings along the inner wall answered with a faint susurration, as if the priestess's memory had been roused. The rune at Astrid's throat flared so violently that she gasped, a sound that cut the hush like a blade. The firelight trembled. From the black beyond the hearth, a sound rose, low, patient, not quite a voice and not quite wind, an answering that threaded through the stone and touched the rune like a finger. It was not human. It said her name. The carvings seemed to breathe when the torchlight touched them, a slow inhalation of stone and memory that made the cave feel less like shelter and more like a listening thing. Each groove held a story: reed crowns, hands cupped to a river, a ledger balanced on a flat stone. The images were worn by centuries of fingers and offerings until they were both clear and unreadable, like a language half remembered. Cold pooled in the hollows between the reliefs, and the air tasted of peat and old smoke, and something metallic that might have been coin or blood. They moved deeper, with the caution of people who know how quickly sanctuary can become trap. Snow clung to their boots at the mouth. Inside, the world narrowed to the small, urgent tasks of survival. Einar set a strip of cloth against his side and winced when he tightened it. The wound there was a hot, private thing that made his breath hitch. Astrid knelt beside him with a pot of warmed water, hands steady despite the tremor that lived in her fingers. She poured, she dabbed, she pressed salve into the cut with a tenderness that surprised him. Tenderness that felt like a confession, in a place where confessions could be dangerous. The fire they coaxed was small and stubborn, a sun no larger than a fist. Its light threw the carvings into relief and made the priestesses' faces look almost alive, as if the women in the stone had turned their heads to watch. Sparks rose and died, like tiny, obedient stars. The cave's throat swallowed sound. Even their breathing seemed too loud. Between the crackle of flame and the hush of stone, the ancestral energy lingered, an aftertaste of ritual, of vows made and kept and broken. It pressed at the edges of the present like a hand that would not let go. He watched her as she worked, the way her jaw set when she concentrated, the way her thumb lingered at the edge of the bandage. There was a history in those small gestures. A woman who had learned to make mercy into a craft. A man who had learned to make protection into a habit. The intimacy of tending a wound, cloth against skin, the heat of breath close, was a dangerous thing. It made them both aware of the other's pulse, the small, human rhythms that the world had tried to erase. Each touch was a promise and a risk. Each silence between them was a ledger waiting to be written. She kept her eyes on the wound, but felt the rune at her throat like a second pulse. Under the cave's low roof, the mark stirred as if it had been listening for this place. It tightened, a cold band under linen, and a pain like a memory flared along her collarbone. The rune had always been a private geography, sometimes a bruise, sometimes a bell, but here it answered the stone. When her fingers brushed the linen, frost bloomed at the tips of her nails and died before it could be named. The reaction was small and immediate, and left her hollowed, as if the power had taken a piece of warmth to pay for its voice. He did not ask the question that hovered like smoke between them. Instead, he wrapped the bandage tighter, his hands steady despite the ache that ran through him. His fingers brushed hers, and the contact was a spark that neither of them let become a flame. The cave's hush made words too loud. They traded instead the small mercies of proximity. He shifted his cloak so that it brushed her shoulder, a human warmth against the cold that lived in her. She let the contact anchor her, and for a moment, the ledger of bargains and the ledger of choices overlapped and made a new, fragile map. The carvings watched them with the patience of old women. One relief showed a woman kneeling at a river, hands cupped. Another showed a crown of reeds and a ledger with a single name. The priestess's marks were thresholds, not answers. Places where the living had once reached and the dead had once listened. The cave hummed with that memory, a low, almost inaudible vibration that threaded through the stone and into the marrow. It made the rune at her throat hum in sympathy. A bell struck in a distant hall. She tried to keep the frost small, to make the rune a whisper rather than a shout. But the cave's old magic was not indifferent. It was a thing that remembered bargains and the faces that had made them. When she moved her hand along the wall, the grooves answered with a susurration like cloth on stone. The air tightened as if the cave itself had leaned in to hear. Her breath came in thin, measured pulls. The rune pulsed in time with the fire. Fear braided with something softer. Relief, perhaps. Or the dangerous comfort of being seen by someone who had chosen to stay. He met her eyes and found there the same mixture of dread and something that wanted to be named. The closeness between them was a dangerous warmth. His steady presence against the cold that lived in her. Her fragile power against the world's ledger. The priestess's cave felt like a place that could hold both mercy and price. And the knowledge of that made every touch feel like a negotiation. They were two people who had been taught to keep their hands clean by doing hard things. Now their hands were dirty with each other's care. A sound rose from deeper in the cave, not a footstep, but a settling. A shift of stone that made the carving shadows tremble. The rune at her throat flared so sharply she had to bite back a cry. The fire's light flickered as if a wind had passed through, though the air was still. She felt, with the animal certainty of someone who has been watched all her life, that something older than the priestesses had turned its attention toward them. The sensation was not merely of being observed, but of being read, as if the cave were opening a ledger and finding their names in the margins. She pressed her palm flat against the wall, feeling the cold through her glove, and the stone answered with a vibration that ran up her arm. The rune thrummed like a bell struck in a distant hall. For a heartbeat. The world narrowed to the press of stone and the sound of their breathing. Then, from the dark beyond the hearth, a presence shifted, patient, vast, and older than the priestess's memory, and she felt, with a clarity that made her knees weak, that she was being watched by something ancient. The rune at her throat had a heartbeat of its own, an undercurrent beneath skin and linen that thrummed like a bell struck in a distant hall. Frost gathered at the edges of the bandage, tiny white crystals that caught the firelight and turned it into a constellation. Breath fogged in the cave, each exhale a small, visible prayer. The hearth's orange made the priestess's carvings look alive. The aurora's green threaded the ceiling like a vein. In that braided light, the rune began to answer the cave. It started as a tremor, a small tightening that made her fingers go numb. She pressed her palm to the wound at his side. The motion meant to steady him, and the rune flared beneath the linen, with a pain that was both old and immediate. The glow was not warm. It was a cold that burned inward, a white that ate the edges of the firelight. For a moment the world narrowed to the sound of her pulse and the bell of the mark. The cave seemed to lean in, listening. He saw it then, saw the way her jaw clenched, the way her shoulders rose as if to hold the pain inside. He had watched frost bloom at her fingertips before, had seen the way the world answered her fear. But this was different. The light under her throat was a thing that reached and wanted to be whole. It made the skin around it look thin, as if the rune had been pressed from the inside. His hand, still bandaged and stained, hovered over hers and did not move. The sight of her suffering cut through him with a clarity that left no room for the old, practical distance he kept from danger. This was not a wound he could stitch. It was a ledger that had been opened. She tried to hide it with small motions, adjusting the linen, turning her face away, making the work of tending his wound into a ritual that would distract them both. Her hands trembled as she tied the knot. The thread slipped once, and she cursed under her breath, a sound swallowed by the cave. The rune answered with a flare that made her gasp. He looked up at that sound, and in his eyes there was a question that had no easy answer. She forced a smile that did not reach her eyes and said nothing. Words felt too blunt for what lived under her skin. The carvings along the wall watched them like patient witnesses. A reed-crowned woman cupped a river in her hands. A ledger lay open on a stone. The priestess's marks were thresholds, places where the living had once reached and the dead had once listened. The cave's old magic was not a thing to be bargained with lightly. It remembered bargains and the faces that had made them. The rune's glow pulsed in sympathy with the grooves, as if the stone itself recognized the ledger she carried and answered in kind. He reached for water and his fingers brushed hers. The contact was a small, electric thing that made the rune flare again, sharper this time, like a struck bell. She flinched, and the pain cut across her face. He saw the way she tried to swallow it down, the way her eyes darted to the carvings as if seeking permission to be human. The realization settled in him like a stone. Her suffering was not occasional or ornamental. It was a constant, a geography she had to navigate every day. He had thought he knew the edges of her danger. He had not known the depth. Fear braided with something else, an ache that had nothing to do with wounds. He felt the old war ache in his ribs and the new, sharper ache of a man who had chosen to keep another's life under his roof. The thought of her carrying such a ledger alone made his hands clench. He wanted to ask the question that would make the ledger legible, to demand the terms, to bargain with a bargain. But the cave's hush made questions feel like trespass. Instead, he fed the fire, turned the pot, and let the small practical motions be a way to stay near, without forcing the truth into the open. She watched him watch her, and the look they shared was a map of things unsaid. Shame sat in her like a stone. She had learned to hide the ledger's edges because the world preferred tidy stories. Sometimes she told herself that if she kept the truth small, it would not reach the ears of men who kept ledgers. Sometimes she told herself that if she loved someone enough, the ledger would not ask for payment. Both thoughts were lies she repeated to keep from being hollowed out by fear. A memory brushed the edges of her mind, water black as glass, a hand that had been warm and then gone, a voice that hadn't spoken in words but in impressions. The memory was a seam she had stitched closed, but the cave's old magic tugged at the thread. She felt the ledger's margins fray. The rune pulsed like a warning. She had kept a secret so long it had become part of her bones. Now the cave's presence made the secret itch to be named. He moved closer, the motion small and inevitable. His hand found the bandage at his side and then her wrist, not to bind but to anchor. The touch was a promise and a question. She met his eyes, and for a breath, the world narrowed to the two of them. The fire's slow breathing, the aurora's green vein, the bell of the rune. She wanted to tell him everything and feared the ledger's cost if she did. The silence between them was a ledger waiting to be written. He reached for her face as if to steady her, thumb brushing the line of her jaw. The rune flared so violently that the firelight seemed to recoil. Pain lanced through her like a memory, and the cave answered with a sound that was not wind, but a low, patient intake. Stone remembering a name. The light under her throat burst into a white that made the carvings look like they were carved from ice. He froze, hand inches from her skin, and the world held its breath. He felt the rune's heat like a second pulse against the night, an ember under linen that burned without flame. The light it threw was not the hearth's orange, but a white that ate color. A cold so bright, it made the cave's carvings look like bones. Her hands trembled as she worked the bandage, fingers that had steadied a fevered child now shaking with a private storm. Breath came quick and shallow between them, a thread of steam that braided with the aurora's green vein overhead. Fear sat in his chest like a stone, not the blunt fear of spear or blade, but the thin, sharp fear of failing someone he had already failed once. He had kept the memory folded away, because memories that hurt are dangerous to carry aloud. The cave's hush made confession feel like a trespass, but the rune's flare had loosened something in him. He let the words come in small pieces, not as a speech, but as a map of a night he had tried to forget. He spoke of a riverbank under a moon that had been pale and indifferent, of men moving like shadows with orders in their mouths. He spoke of a woman whose lips were blue and whose fingers had closed on his wrist like a plea. He spoke of the weight of command, how it can press a man's shoulders down until he bends to the world's will, and how he had been shoved aside by momentum and duty. The confession was not theatrical. It was a raw, practical thing. The memory of hands that had slipped, the sound of water swallowing breath, the uselessness of words when the current takes what it will. He did not say her name at first. He said the shape of the moment, the small geometry of trying and failing. When the name came, it was a benediction and a wound. He had argued to stay, he said, had tried to pull the woman from the river, had felt the shove of men who had been taught to obey. He had felt the river take her hand from his, and had woken later with the image of her face smudged by smoke and time. He had buried the rest because the rest was a weight that would have made him sink. She listened as if the cave itself had leaned in. The rune at her throat hummed like a bell, struck in a distant hall. The light under her linen pulsed in sympathy with the memory he offered. Her fingers stilled on the cloth, and the tremor in them slowed. The vulnerability in his voice was a thing she had not expected to find. He had been a man of steady hands and quiet decisions, a man who kept his face like a shield. Now that shield had a crack, and she saw the rawness beneath. The way his jaw had always tightened when he thought of orders. The way his eyes had a far-off look when the wind turned a certain way. She had known him as protector. She had not known him as someone who had once been undone by the river. The intimacy of the moment was not sudden, but cumulative. Small gestures became declarations. The way his hand hovered over hers and then settled. The way his breath matched the rhythm of her pulse. The way the firelight carved their faces into a private map. Silence was not absence, but a language between them. He reached for the bandage again, and his fingers brushed the inside of her wrist. The contact was a spark that neither of them let become a flame. The cave's carvings watched like patient witnesses, reed-crowned women and ledgers in stone, and the priestess's memory hummed in the walls as if approving or warning. She saw the man he had been and the man he had become in the same breath, the soldier who had been taught to obey and the man who now chose to stay. The revelation of his failure did not make her pity him. It made her understand the ledger he carried. She had carried her own ledger for years, the mark at her throat, the bargain with the river, and now she saw his ledger laid beside hers. The two of them were not separate debts, but a shared accounting, a dangerous arithmetic that could ask for payment in ways neither could predict. Words were scarce. He said once, in a voice that was almost a whisper, "I tried." The sentence was small and enormous at once. It was not an absolution. It was a confession that opened a space where trust could grow. She answered with a look that held both forgiveness and a question. What else had he kept? The cave's hush made the question heavy. The rune at her throat pulsed, a bell that wanted to be heard, and the fire's light trembled as if in sympathy. He let himself be vulnerable in ways he had never allowed before. A hand that shook, a throat that tightened, a silence that was not stoicism but grief. She reached for him then, not to mend the wound he had described, but to hold the man who had carried it. Her fingers found the line of his jaw, the motion gentle and fierce. The contact steadied him like a rope thrown across a chasm. He closed his eyes and leaned into the touch, the cave stone pressing around them like a cradle. The closeness between them deepened into something that was both dangerous and necessary. Breath mingled. The rune's light softened and then flared again, as if impatient with the human tenderness. He opened his eyes and saw in her face the same mixture of fear and longing he felt in his own chest. The moment stretched, a fragile thing balanced on the edge of confession and consequence. She drew a breath that tasted of river and old prayers, and, with a motion that made the cave seem to hold its breath with her, prepared to tell him the truth she had kept folded inside her like a knife. The cave quieted as if the stone itself had taken a breath and decided to listen. The hearth's small sun shrank to a patient glow. Even the carvings seemed to hold their relief still, waiting. Beneath that hush, the rune at her throat began to pulse, a white drumbeat under linen that answered the silence with a light so cold it felt like a second moon. Frost threaded the air where the glow touched it, and every exhale became a visible prayer. She let the first confession fall like a stone into that hush, not as a story told for pity, but as a ledger opened at last. The words were small and precise, the way one names a wound. She had gone to the river because there was nothing left to bargain with. No coin, no priest's chant, only the raw, animal need to keep a life that mattered to her. The water had been black and patient. The fevered breath of the boy she loved had been a thing she could not bear to lose. She had cupped her hands and offered what she had, a name, a promise, a plea. The river answered with a touch that was not mercy, but a contract. She said the river took her and then gave her back. She said the return had a seam sewn into it, a clause whispered in a voice that was not human. Hell did not wear a crown. Hell was ledger and hall and the hush of the dead. The bargain had been simple in its cruelty. Life for life, a balance written in a hand that did not ask for consent. She had taken warmth back into a house and left a debt in the world. Saying it aloud made the rune at her throat flare, and the light under her linen looked like a wound opened to the sky. Shame sat in her like a stone. She had not bargained for power, she had bargained for a breath. The frost that answered her touch afterward had been a consequence she had not wanted to name. Sometimes, in the quiet between chores and prayers, she imagined the life she had pulled back as a coin pried from another's palm. The thought hollowed her. She had not wanted to be a thief. She had wanted only to keep a child's laugh from going out. He listened without the theatrics of pity. The cave's low roof made every sound intimate. His breath, the scrape of cloth, the small clink of a pot, each became a witness. When she finished, the silence that followed was not empty, but full of the weight of what had been admitted. He did not speak at once. His face was a map of things he had learned to hide. The soldier's set jaw, the man's softening at the edges. The wound at his side throbbed in time with the rune's pulse, and the firelight carved his features into planes of shadow and warmth. He reached for her with a motion that was both practical and intimate, steadying the cup of water, folding a cloth, pressing the bandage tighter where it needed to be. His hands were careful, the way hands are when they know the difference between mending and making worse. When his fingers brushed the line of her jaw, the contact was a small electric thing that made the rune flare like a struck bell. She flinched and then leaned into the touch, not away. The closeness was forbidden in the ledger's terms. She carried a debt that could demand a life, but it was also the only honest thing left between them. He said nothing grand. He said, in a voice that was low and steady, "You did what you had to." The sentence was not absolution. It was a choice offered without calculation. It was the kind of vow that does not need a priest's ink. She let the words settle like a warm hand on a cold stone. The shame did not vanish, but it shifted shape. It became something they could hold together, rather than a secret she had to carry alone. Their intimacy deepened not in a single dramatic gesture, but in a series of small, dangerous mercies. He moved closer until the heat of his shoulder warmed the linen at her collar. She let her head rest against him for a breath, feeling the steady press of his heartbeat under her ear. The rune's light softened as if mollified by the human nearness, then pulsed again. An impatient reminder that bargains do not dissolve because two people choose to be tender. She told him the clause Hell had whispered, that the river's balance would demand payment, that the life returned might be balanced by another taken, that the ledger could call for a name she could not predict. Saying it aloud made the cave seem smaller and the world larger in a way that frightened them both. He absorbed the sentence like a man taking on a load he had not expected, but would not refuse. The fear in his eyes was not for himself alone. It was the dread of being the one the ledger might name. They held each other in the hush that followed. Two bodies pressed against the cold, two breaths braided. The priestess's carvings watched with the patience of old women who had seen bargains made and broken. Outside, the wind shifted. Subtle at first, a change in the way the pines sighed, and the aurora's green vein kinked like a vein under pressure. The cave's mouth breathed in, and the sound carried a new note. Not the wind they had known, but the tread of someone approaching, deliberate and measured. The change in the air was a signal. The world beyond the stone had noticed their confession. Footsteps came first, soft, deliberate, a rhythm that did not belong to wind or animal. They pressed against the cave mouth like a question, a measured tread that made the stone under Einar's boots feel thin. The sound carried a weight, iron on leather, the muffled scrape of harness, the patient breath of horses held in check. For a moment, the cave held its own breath, and the little fire they had coaxed into life seemed to shrink away from the mouth as if ashamed to be seen. He rose without ceremony, the motion practiced and quiet. The bandage at his side tugged and flared, but the pain was a small thing compared to the shape of what might come. He stepped between her and the dark with the blunt, absolute instinct of a man who had learned to be a wall. "I will not let them take you," he said, and the words were not a boast, but a promise carved in the low, steady voice of someone who had already chosen. The cave answered as if it understood. The runes along the wall brightened in a slow, approving pulse, the grooves catching the firelight and throwing it back like a benediction. She watched him make that promise with a look that was equal parts fear and something that wanted to be named. The rune at her throat hummed in sympathy. A bell struck in a distant hall. The light under her linen softened for a breath, then flared again, impatient, hungry. The promise he made did not erase the ledger she carried. It only shifted the weight. It made the debt a thing they might bear together, and that thought was both terrifying and tender. Outside, the tread of boots multiplied. Voices, low, ceremonial, answered one another in a cadence that belonged to courts and hunts. The riders were near, The sound of their approach was a geography. A low horn, the scrape of metal, the whisper of banners. The cave's mouth framed the world like a painting, and beyond it, the snow lay like a white accusation. The aurora braided the sky in a slow, indifferent seam. The blood moon hung like a witness. The world had narrowed to the small, urgent geometry of staying alive. He moved to the mouth and peered into the dark. Shapes shifted, helmets catching the moon, banners like dark leaves. The leader's silhouette was a blade against the sky. The riders did not shout. They did not need to. Their presence was a law, the claim. Mark they had left in the snow was a sentence written in frost. Now they had come to read it aloud. She came to his side without being asked, not because she needed protection. She had been her own guardian for years, but because the promise he had made had opened a space where fear could be shared. Her hand found his, fingers slipping into the hollow at his wrist, and the contact was a small, electric thing. The rune at her throat flared at the touch, a white flare that made the carvings look like they were carved from ice. For a heartbeat, the world was only breath and pulse, and the press of two bodies against the cold. He turned and looked at her as if trying to memorize the line of her jaw, the way the moonlight caught the pale of her skin, the small tremor in her hands. The intimacy between them was a dangerous warmth, forbidden by the ledger she carried, necessary by the law of two people who had chosen one another in a world that kept accounts. He wanted to say everything, vows, plans, the kind of promises that men make in halls with witnesses. But the cave's hush made words too loud. Instead, he tightened his grip on her hand and let the silence be the vow. The runes along the wall answered the promise with a low vibration that ran through the stone and into their bones. It was as if the cave itself recognized the pledge and approved, a small, ancient thing that had seen bargains made and chosen sides. The fire's light steadied. The carvings' faces seemed less like warnings and more like witnesses. For a moment, the priestess's memory felt like an ally rather than a ledger. Then the rider's horn blew, a single ceremonial note that rolled across the snow and into the cave like a drum. The sound made the fire gutter and the aurora shiver. The leader's voice called out, not a question but a summons, the kind of voice that expects obedience. "Come forth," it said, and the syllables were a law. He did not move to answer. Instead, he drew her closer, the motion both protective and intimate. Their faces were inches apart, breath braided with breath. The rune at her throat pulsed in time with the horn, a white drumbeat that made the air taste of iron. The moment stretched, a fragile thing, balanced on the edge of confession and consequence. He could feel the ledger's teeth at the back of her throat. He could feel the way the world might demand payment for the life she had taken back. She lifted her eyes to his, and in that look, there was a confession waiting to be given, and a plea not to be judged for it. He read the lines of her face like a map, and found there the same mixture of shame and fierce, stubborn love he had felt since the river had first put her in his path. He leaned in, not to steal a kiss, but to anchor her, to make a human promise against a world that kept accounts. His lips brushed her temple, a benediction and a vow. The cave answered again, the runes flaring as if to mark the moment. But the sound outside changed, no longer merely horns and boots, but a voice that was not wholly human, threaded with river and ledger and the hush of halls where the dead keep their names. It slid under the cave's lip, and touched the rune at her throat, like a finger on a bell. Astrid, it said. And the name it used was not the one she had been given in the world of men. It was the name the river had whispered when it returned her, the name that belonged to bargains and to halls of the dead, the forbidden name that should never be spoken aloud. The syllable hung in the air like a blade. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. This tale is inspired by Nordic dreams and heart. Stay close for the next chapter of this saga. With love, Claire.